The North Sea gnawed at the legs of the Colossus, a behemoth of an oil rig, spitting salt spray that froze on the metal walkways. 200 miles from the nearest land, the Colossus was a world unto itself, a self-contained ecosystem of steel, pipes, and restless souls. For Juliet Donovan, the rig was as familiar as her own reflection. 3 years she'd spent diving in these frigid depths, tending to the underwater infrastructure that kept the black gold flowing. But tonight, the familiar held a razor's edge of unease. A persistent hum of anxiety had permeated the Colossus for weeks. Equipment malfunctions, once rare, were becoming commonplace. Whispers of sabotage ran through the crew like rats through the bilge. The tension was a thick, palpable thing, clinging to the air like the ever-present scent of diesel and brine. Juliet stood on the outer deck, bundled against the biting wind, the rhythmic clang of machinery a constant backdrop. She was scheduled for a routine dive at dawn, but sleep had evaded her. A premonition, perhaps, or just the shared apprehension that had infected the entire rig. Then it split the night. A crimson flare, sudden and stark, arced across the inky horizon. It hung in the air for a heart-stopping moment, a fiery tear against the velvet black, before plummeting into the darkness. Silence descended upon the rig. Every eye turned towards the fleeting spectacle. The hum of machinery seemed to fade, replaced by the pounding of hearts and the ragged intake of breath. What in God's name? A gruff voice broke the silence. It was Big Ed, the rig's foreman, his face etched with concern. Juliet felt a knot tighten in her stomach. A flare meant only one thing: distress. A ship in trouble. The radio crackled to life. Static, then a panicked voice, barely audible above the noise. Mayday, mayday, fire on board, abandoning ship. The transmission cut out, swallowed by the static. A murmur rippled through the assembled crew. Fear mixed with morbid curiosity. 200 miles from land, rescue was a long shot. The North Sea was unforgiving, its icy grip claiming lives without remorse. Captain Hansen, a man weathered by years at sea, appeared on the deck. His face was grim, his gaze fixed on the point where the flare had vanished. "Any idea of the vessel's position?" he asked, his voice tight. The radio operator, a young man named Finn, shook his head. "Signal was too weak, Captain. Couldn't get a fix." "Damn it," Hansen muttered. He turned to Big Ed. "Prepare a rescue boat. We can't just—" He was interrupted by a chorus of dissenting voices. "Captain, it's too risky," one crew member shouted. "We're short-handed as it is. What if it's a trap?" "These waters are crawling with pirates, Captain," another chimed in. "We could be sailing into an ambush." The paranoia that had been simmering beneath the surface now boiled over. The recent malfunctions, the whispers of sabotage, had created an atmosphere of mistrust. Juliet stepped forward. "Captain," she said, her voice clear and firm, "we have to try. There are people out there who need our help." Hansen looked at her, his eyes searching hers. He knew Juliet. He knew her courage, her unwavering sense of duty. He also knew the risks. "Donovan," he said, his voice heavy with responsibility, "we don't even know if there's anything left to rescue. That flare could have been hours ago." "But what if it wasn't?" Juliet persisted. "What if there are survivors clinging to wreckage? We can't just abandon them." Her words hung in the air, a stark reminder of their shared humanity. The murmurs of dissent quieted. The crew looked at each other, their faces reflecting the internal struggle between fear and compassion. Hansen sighed, the weight of the decision settling on his shoulders. He looked out at the dark, unforgiving sea and then back at Juliet. "All right, Donovan," he said finally. "We'll go. But we're taking a small team. And we're going in armed." He turned to Big Ed. "Get the fastest boat ready. Donovan, you're with me." As the rescue boat was lowered into the churning water, Juliet couldn't shake the feeling that they were sailing into the unknown, into something far more dangerous than a simple rescue mission. The flare, burning bright in her memory, felt less like a cry for help and more like a lure. The rescue boat, a sturdy inflatable craft powered by twin outboard motors, bucked and swayed in the choppy seas. Salt spray stung Juliet's face as they sliced through the waves, the Colossus shrinking behind them, a beacon of light against the encroaching darkness. The air was thick with the smell of diesel and the ever-present tang of the sea. Captain Hansen stood at the helm, his jaw set, his eyes scanning the horizon. Beside him, Juliet gripped the railing, her gaze fixed on the swirling blackness ahead. The two other crew members, Big Ed and a wiry young engineer named Liam, huddled in the stern, their faces grim. They motored on for what felt like an eternity, the darkness punctuated only by the rhythmic throb of the engines and the occasional cry of a gull overhead. Then, through the swirling mist, a faint orange glow appeared. As they drew closer, the glow intensified, resolving itself into the flickering flames of a burning ship. The vessel, a mid-sized freighter, was listing heavily to starboard, its superstructure engulfed in flames. Thick black smoke billowed into the sky, staining the darkness. The acrid smell of burning wood and fuel filled the air. The sight was both terrifying and mesmerizing. "Any sign of life?" Hansen shouted over the roar of the flames. Juliet scanned the wreckage with her binoculars. Debris bobbed in the turbulent water. Life rafts, some still burning, drifted aimlessly. She saw no movement, no sign of survivors. "Nothing, Captain," she replied, her voice tight with disappointment. "Looks like we're too late." Just as Hansen was about to give the order to turn back, a faint cry reached them, carried on the wind. "Help! Over here!" The cry came from the opposite side of the burning ship, obscured by the smoke and flames. Hansen steered the boat cautiously towards the sound, navigating through the floating debris. Then they saw him. Clinging to a piece of wreckage, his face pale and streaked with soot, was a lone survivor. They pulled him aboard, his body trembling with cold and exhaustion. He collapsed onto the deck, coughing and gasping for air. "Easy there," Hansen said, kneeling beside him. "You're safe now." The survivor looked up, his eyes wide with fear and gratitude. He was a man of average height and build, with dark hair plastered to his forehead and a neatly trimmed beard. He wore a simple oil-stained jumpsuit. "Thank you," he croaked, his voice hoarse. "Thank you for saving me." "What happened?" Hansen asked. "What's your name?" "Elliot Sullivan," he replied, taking a deep breath. "I'm the ship's engineer. There was a fire in the engine room, spread so fast, everyone else, they got off, but I got trapped." He trailed off, his body racked by another bout of coughing. Juliet knelt beside him, offering him a blanket and a flask of water. He took a sip, then looked at her, his eyes filled with a strange intensity. You saved my life," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "We just did what anyone would have done," Juliet replied, trying to ignore the unsettling feeling that crept over her. There was something about Elliot Sullivan, something in his eyes, that made her uneasy. They returned to the Colossus with their lone survivor. As they helped Elliot onto the rig, the crew gathered around, their faces a mixture of relief and curiosity. Elliot repeated his story, his voice trembling with emotion, describing the sudden fire, the frantic evacuation, his desperate struggle for survival. He charmed the crew with his apparent vulnerability, accepting their offers of food and dry clothes with humble gratitude. Juliet watched from a distance, a knot of unease tightening in her stomach. While everyone else seemed captivated by Elliot's harrowing tale, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. There were subtle inconsistencies in his story, details that didn't quite add up. And there was a strange familiarity about him, a nagging sense that she had seen him before, although she was certain they had never met. Later that night, as the Colossus settled back into its routine, Juliet found herself drawn back to the deck, to the spot where they had first sighted the burning ship. The image of the flare, burning so brightly against the darkness, still haunted her. It had seemed like a cry for help, a beacon of hope. But now, as she looked out at the vast expanse of the North Sea, she couldn't shake the feeling that it had been something else entirely. A signal. A warning. The Colossus hummed with a nervous energy. The rescue of Elliot Sullivan had been the main topic of conversation for the past 24 hours. While most of the crew were sympathetic to the sole survivor, the undercurrent of unease that had plagued the rig for weeks remained. In fact, it seemed to have intensified. The equipment malfunctions continued. A vital pump seized during Juliet's scheduled dive, forcing her to abort. Later, a critical sensor in the drilling platform failed, triggering a near shutdown of the entire operation. These incidents, previously dismissed as isolated events, were now being viewed with increasing suspicion. Juliet found herself increasingly isolated. Her persistent questions about Elliot's story were met with polite dismissal or outright hostility. "Give the man a break, Donovan," Big Ed had grumbled. "He's been through hell." But Juliet couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Elliot's charm had worked on everyone else, but she remained unconvinced. She observed him discreetly, noting his almost constant presence in the rig's common areas, his easy camaraderie with the crew, his frequent trips to the satellite phone booth. She noticed the way he always seemed to be around when something went wrong, his face a mask of concerned helpfulness. One evening, while the rest of the crew were gathered in the mess hall for dinner, Juliet saw Elliot slip out onto the helipad. He held a satellite phone to his ear, speaking in low, hushed tones. She couldn't hear what he was saying, but the furtive glances he cast around the rig confirmed her suspicions. He was hiding something. Later that night, as Juliet tossed and turned in her bunk, she heard a faint tapping coming from the corridor outside her cabin. She got up and opened the door a crack, peering out into the dimly lit passageway. Two crew members, Liam and another engineer named Finn, were huddled together, their voices low and urgent. "Did you see him, on the helipad, talking on the sat phone?" "Yeah, and the way he keeps asking about the drilling platform, it's creepy. Something's not right with that guy, I tell ya." Juliet closed the door softly, her heart pounding. The whispers were spreading. The paranoia that had infected the rig was now turning towards Elliot. The next day, the atmosphere in the mess hall was thick with tension. The usual boisterous banter was replaced by hushed conversations and furtive glances. Stories of maritime scams and insurance fraud began to circulate. The crew, initially sympathetic to Elliot, were now starting to question his story, their fear fueled by the ongoing equipment malfunctions and Juliet's persistent suspicions. "You know," one crew member said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I heard about a case a few years back. A guy set fire to his own ship, collected the insurance money, disappeared without a trace." "And what about those Somali pirates?" another chimed in. "They're getting bolder these days. Could be he's one of them, scouting for a bigger score." The whispers grew louder, feeding on each other, morphing into accusations. The crew was divided, some still clinging to the belief that Elliot was a genuine victim, others convinced that he was hiding something sinister. The tension on the Colossus, already at a breaking point, ratcheted up another notch. Juliet knew she was right about Elliot, but the spreading paranoia, while validating her concerns, also painted her as a source of the growing unrest. The crew's divided loyalties made it harder to distinguish genuine concern from a desire to find a scapegoat for the escalating problems plaguing the rig. The relentless hum of the Colossus vibrated through Juliet's bones, a constant reminder of the precarious balance of life 200 miles out at sea. But today the usual rhythm felt off, a dissonant chord in the familiar symphony of the rig. Something crucial was missing. Juliet sat in the control room, staring at the blank screen in front of her. The rig's operational data, a vital stream of information about every system on the platform, was gone. Vanished. Not just corrupted or inaccessible, but completely erased. "It's like it never existed," Finn, the young radio operator, said, his voice laced with disbelief. He ran a hand through his already disheveled hair. "I've checked the backups, the offline servers, everything. It's gone." Juliet felt a cold dread creep up her spine. This wasn't a simple technical glitch. This was deliberate. And she knew with a chilling certainty who was responsible. She had spent the past few days discreetly monitoring Elliot. She'd seen him lurking near the control room, his gaze fixed on the banks of computer terminals. She'd seen him fiddling with a small, unmarked device, something he quickly concealed whenever anyone approached. "When was the last time you saw the data?" she asked Finn, trying to keep her voice even. He frowned, trying to recall. "Yesterday afternoon, I think. Everything was normal then. I checked the systems before I went off shift." "And who was on duty after you?" Finn hesitated. "Sullivan. He was covering for Big Ed." Juliet felt a knot tighten in her stomach. It was him. She had no concrete proof, but she knew it in her gut. Elliot Sullivan was not who he claimed to be. She left the control room, her mind racing. She needed to find someone she could trust, someone who would listen to her concerns without dismissing them as paranoia. She thought of Captain Hansen, but he was preoccupied with the ongoing investigation into the fire on Elliot's ship. Then she thought of Mr. Petrov, the rig's senior engineer. He was a gruff, no-nonsense man, but he was also fair and respected by the crew. She found him in the engine room, overseeing the repair of the faulty pump. He listened patiently as Juliet explained her suspicions about Elliot, the missing data, the strange device she had seen him with. He didn't interrupt, his expression unreadable. When she finished, he sighed, wiping a grease-stained hand across his forehead. "Donovan," he said, his voice grave, "I know you've been worried about Sullivan. And frankly, so have I. There's something off about him." He paused, his eyes fixed on the intricate workings of the engine. "There's something else you should know," he continued, his voice low. "This rig, it's not just pumping oil. We're carrying some sensitive cargo." Juliet raised an eyebrow. "Sensitive cargo?" Petrov nodded. "Experimental deep-sea mining technology. worth millions. It's being transported to a research facility on the mainland. He looked directly at Juliet, his gaze intense. This technology, it's highly coveted. Several corporations would kill to get their hands on it. The pieces clicked into place in Juliet's mind. The sabotage, the fire, Elliot's sudden appearance, the missing data, it all pointed to one thing: industrial espionage. Elliot Sullivan wasn't a victim. He was a corporate spy. And the Colossus, with its valuable cargo and its increasingly paranoid crew, was his target. The weight of Petrov's revelation settled on Juliet like a physical burden. The pieces of the puzzle, once scattered and confusing, now formed a chillingly clear picture. Elliot Sullivan was a corporate spy, and she, unwittingly, had helped him infiltrate the Colossus. The implications were staggering. Not only was the valuable deep-sea mining technology at risk, but the entire rig, its crew, and its precarious existence in the unforgiving North Sea were now in jeopardy. Juliet thanked Petrov and left the engine room, her mind reeling. She needed to act, and fast. She needed proof, concrete evidence that would expose Elliot and his scheme. But as she made her way back to her cabin, a sense of unease washed over her. The rig felt different, the usual background hum of activity replaced by an almost unnerving silence. Crew members she passed avoided her gaze, their faces tight with suspicion. Even Big Ed, usually jovial and quick with a greeting, simply nodded curtly and hurried past. When she reached her cabin, she found the door ajar. Her heart pounded in her chest as she cautiously pushed it open. The room was a mess. Her belongings were strewn across the floor, drawers pulled open, contents spilled onto the carpet. And then she saw it. Lying on her bunk, amidst the chaos, was a small, unmarked device. The same device she had seen Elliot concealing. Next to it, a handwritten note. "Consider this a warning." Juliet felt a wave of nausea wash over her. It was a setup. A blatant, almost theatrical frame-up. Elliot was not only a spy, but a manipulator, a puppet master pulling strings from the shadows. He was framing her for his own crimes. A klaxon blared through the rig, its insistent wail cutting through the silence. An announcement crackled over the intercom. "All hands to the control room. Security breach. All hands to the control room." Juliet knew with a sickening certainty what she would find there. The control room was a scene of controlled chaos. Crew members huddled around the computer terminals, their faces grim. Captain Hansen stood at the center, his jaw clenched, his eyes blazing with fury. "The mining technology data," he barked, his voice tight with suppressed rage. "It's been accessed. And not only that, but the security protocols have been bypassed. Someone has deliberately disabled the failsafe systems." He turned to Juliet, his eyes hardening. "Donovan," he said, his voice laced with accusation. "Where were you during the last hour?" Juliet felt a chill run down her spine. It was happening. Just as she had feared. Elliot was framing her, and it was working. "Captain," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "I can explain," but Hansen cut her off. "Explain this," he said, holding up the unmarked device. "This was found in your cabin. The same device used to bypass our security systems." Juliet opened her mouth to protest, to tell him about Elliot, about the setup, but the words caught in her throat. The looks on the faces of the crew members around her, a mixture of suspicion, fear, and outright hostility, told her everything she needed to know. They believed Hansen. They believed Elliot. They believed she was the saboteur. I didn't," she stammered, but the words sounded hollow even to her own ears. "Don't insult my intelligence, Donovan," Hansen snapped. "We have evidence. We have witnesses. You were seen near the control room earlier today. And now this." He gestured towards the device. "You're confined to quarters, pending a full investigation." Two burly security guards stepped forward, flanking Juliet. She wanted to fight, to scream, to tell them the truth, but she knew it was futile. Elliot had woven his web of deceit too tightly. She was trapped. As they led her away, she caught Elliot's eye across the room. He stood near the back, his face a mask of concerned neutrality. But in his eyes, she saw a flicker of something else. Triumph. Juliet was escorted to her cabin, the two security guards posting themselves outside the door. The room, still in disarray from the earlier search, felt less like a sanctuary and more like a prison cell. She sat on the edge of her bunk, her mind racing. She was trapped, framed, and alone. The crew, once her comrades, now viewed her as a traitor. Elliot, the man she had rescued, the man she had felt a strange unease about from the moment she saw him, had orchestrated her downfall with chilling precision. She looked around the ransacked cabin, a sense of despair washing over her. But then, a spark of defiance ignited within her. She wouldn't give up. She wouldn't let Elliot win. She would find a way to clear her name, to expose his lies, to reveal the truth. She had to. Not just for herself, but for the crew, for the Colossus, and for the safety of everyone on board. The stakes were too high to simply surrender. The stale air in the cabin pressed down on Juliet, heavy with the scent of spilled coffee and the faint tang of the sea. The rhythmic clang of machinery, once a comforting constant, now grated on her nerves, a soundtrack to her confinement. The 2 guards stationed outside her door were a constant, silent reminder of her predicament. She paced the small space restlessly, her mind a whirlwind of thoughts. She had to act and fast. Elliot's plan, whatever it was unfolding. The missing data, the disabled failsafe systems, the rising tension among the crew, it all pointed to something bigger, something more sinister than simple industrial espionage. She needed proof. Something tangible, something irrefutable that would expose Elliot and clear her name. But where to start? The cabin had already been searched, presumably thoroughly. Anything incriminating, anything that could link her to the sabotage, had undoubtedly been planted. Juliet stopped pacing and looked around the small, cluttered space. Her gaze settled on the small bag Elliot had brought aboard, the one he guarded so closely. It had been searched, she knew, but perhaps, just perhaps, they had missed something. She approached the bag cautiously, her heart pounding in her chest. It was a simple duffel bag, made of heavy canvas, the kind commonly used by seamen. It felt surprisingly light. She unzipped it slowly, her eyes scanning the contents. Clothes, toiletries, a few books, nothing out of the ordinary. She rummaged through the bag more thoroughly, feeling for anything unusual, anything that might have been overlooked. Her fingers brushed against something hard, something concealed beneath a folded sweater. She pulled it out. It was a small metal box, locked with a combination padlock. Juliet's pulse quickened. This was it. This had to be it. She felt a surge of adrenaline, a renewed sense of purpose. But how to open it? She examined the padlock closely. 4 digits. Thousands of possible combinations. Could take hours, days even, to crack it. Time she didn't have. She thought of Elliot, of the way he carried himself, of the subtle clues she had observed over the past few days. He was meticulous, precise, almost obsessive about details. He would have chosen a combination that was meaningful to him, something he could easily remember. She closed her eyes, trying to recall anything she had learned about him, anything that might offer a clue. His story about the fire, his claim to be the ship's engineer, his frequent trips to the satellite phone. Then it hit her. The ship. He had mentioned its name. The Aurora. And he had given its registration number. 4 digits. Juliet's hands trembled as she entered the 4 digits into the padlock. A soft click. The lock sprung open. Inside the box, nestled in a bed of foam, were several items. A small, sophisticated-looking device, similar to the one that had been planted in her cabin. A set of specialized tools, the kind used for bypassing electronic security systems. And a stack of documents. Juliet carefully unfolded the top document. It was a contract bearing the logo of a rival corporation, a company known for its aggressive tactics and its ruthless pursuit of new technologies. The contract outlined a plan to acquire the deep-sea mining technology currently being transported on the Colossus. And at the bottom, in bold, flowing script, was Elliot Sullivan's signature. Below that contract were detailed schematics of the Colossus, highlighting key systems and vulnerabilities. There were also encrypted messages, detailing a plan to disable the rig's safety systems and create a diversion, allowing for the theft of the technology. Juliet felt a wave of relief wash over her. She had the proof she needed. She had exposed Elliot's true identity, his motives, and his elaborate scheme. Now, she just had to get this information to someone who could help. She glanced at the small device in the box. It was similar to the one she had seen Elliot using on the helipad. A satellite communication device. She picked it up, her fingers fumbling with the controls. She had seen Elliot use it, she knew the basic functions. She activated the device, her heart pounding in her chest. She had to be quick. The guards outside her door could burst in at any moment. She scrolled through the contacts list, searching for a name she recognized, a name she could trust. She found it. Mr. Petrov. She typed a short, coded message, detailing her discovery, the evidence she had found, the imminent danger facing the rig. She pressed send, then quickly deactivated the device, concealing it back in the box. Just as she finished, she heard the sound of footsteps approaching her cabin. The door swung open, revealing Captain Hansen, his face grim, his eyes fixed on her. Captain Hansen stood in the doorway, flanked by the two security guards. His expression was a mixture of anger and something else Juliet couldn't quite decipher. A flicker of doubt, perhaps? "We have a situation, Donovan," he said, his voice low and tight. "A serious situation." Juliet met his gaze, her own expression a mixture of defiance and apprehension. She held the metal box tightly in her hand, her fingers tracing the outline of the lock. "I know," she said, her voice steady. "And I can explain." Hansen raised an eyebrow. "Explain?" he repeated, his voice laced with skepticism. "Explain how this device," he held up the device that had been planted in her cabin, "ended up in your possession? Explain how you managed to bypass our security systems, access the mining technology data, and disable the failsafe protocols." Juliet took a deep breath, steeling herself. This was it. Her one chance to expose Elliot and clear her name. "That device wasn't mine," she said, her voice clear and firm. "It was planted. I was framed." Hansen's expression hardened. "Framed? By whom?" "By Elliot Sullivan," Juliet replied, her gaze unwavering. "He's not who he claims to be. He's a corporate spy working for a rival company. He set fire to his own ship, orchestrated his own rescue, and infiltrated this rig to steal the deep-sea mining technology." Hansen's eyes narrowed. "That's a serious accusation, Donovan. Do you have any proof?" Juliet held up the metal box. "This," she said, "is all the proof you need." She opened the box, revealing its contents. The communication device, the specialized tools, the contract bearing Elliot's signature. She explained everything, the coded message she had sent to Petrov, the details of Elliot's plan, the imminent danger facing the rig. Hansen listened intently, his expression shifting from skepticism to disbelief to dawning comprehension. He examined the contents of the box, his eyes scanning the documents, his face hardening with each passing moment. "Where is Sullivan now?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. "I don't know," Juliet replied, "but I suspect he's not far. He'll be waiting for his opportunity to make his move." Hansen turned to one of the guards. "Find Sullivan. Bring him here. Now." The guard nodded and hurried out of the cabin. Hansen turned back to Juliet, his expression now a mixture of gratitude and grim determination. "Donovan," he said, "I owe you an apology. I should have listened to you. I should have trusted my instincts." Juliet nodded, a wave of relief washing over her. She had been vindicated. The truth was out. But the relief was short-lived. Just as Hansen finished speaking, a loud crash echoed through the rig, followed by the shrill wail of alarms. Then a voice, cold and calculating, crackled over the intercom. "Captain Hansen," the voice said, "I believe we have some unfinished business." It was Elliot. Hansen's face hardened. "Sullivan," he growled into the intercom. "Where are you?" "I'm afraid that's not important," Elliot replied, his voice laced with amusement. "What is important is that I have what I came for. The deep-sea mining technology is now in my possession. And thanks to your oversight, Captain, the rig's safety systems are conveniently disabled." Juliet felt a chill run down her spine. Elliot had made his move. He had the technology and he had control of the rig. "Sullivan, you're playing a dangerous game," Hansen warned. "On the contrary, Captain," Elliot replied, his voice smooth and confident. "I'm winning. And as for dangerous, well, let's just say things are about to get a lot more dangerous for everyone on this rig." Hansen grabbed the intercom. "Security teams converge on the drilling platform. Sullivan is there. I repeat, Sullivan is on the drilling platform. Use extreme caution." He turned to Juliet, his eyes filled with a grim resolve. "Come on, Donovan," he said. "We have a spy to catch." They raced out of the cabin, the alarms still blaring, the rig shuddering beneath their feet. As they ran towards the drilling platform, Juliet couldn't shake the feeling that they were running towards something far more dangerous than a single corporate spy. Something that could jeopardize not only the Colossus but the lives of everyone on board. They reached the drilling platform, a vast, open space dominated by the towering derrick and the complex network of pipes and machinery. Security teams were already in position, their weapons drawn, their faces tense. But there was no sign of Elliot. "Where is he?" Hansen demanded, scanning the area. Just then, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was Elliot, his face pale, his eyes gleaming with a cold, triumphant light. He held a small detonator-like device in his hand. "Looking for me, Captain?" he asked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Hansen stepped forward, his hand reaching for his sidearm. "Sullivan, don't do anything stupid. It's over." Elliot smiled, a chillingly empty expression. "It's just beginning, Captain," he said, his finger hovering over the button on the detonator. "And this," he gestured towards the device, "is just a little insurance policy." Juliet's blood ran cold. She knew with a sickening certainty what he was planning. He wasn't just stealing the technology. He was going to destroy the rig. She lunged forward, but it was too late. Elliot pressed the button. A blinding flash of light erupted from the drilling platform, followed by a deafening roar. The Colossus shuddered violently, the metal groaning under the strain. Juliet was thrown to the ground, the force of the explosion knocking the wind out of her. She struggled to her feet, her ears ringing, her vision blurred. Smoke and debris filled the air, obscuring everything. She coughed, choking on the acrid fumes. Through the swirling smoke, she saw Elliot standing amidst the chaos, his face illuminated by the flickering flames. He was no longer the frightened, vulnerable survivor she had rescued. He was a cold, calculating predator reveling in his victory. He turned and walked towards the edge of the platform, his silhouette outlined against the fiery backdrop. He paused for a moment, then looked back at Juliet, his eyes filled with a chilling amusement. "You saved my life, Donovan," he said, his voice barely audible above the roar of the flames. "And for that I thank you." Then he jumped. The acrid stench of smoke and burning metal clawed at Juliet's throat. Disoriented and bruised, she pushed herself up, the deck plating vibrating beneath her. The explosion had ripped through the drilling platform, sending tremors through the entire rig. The Colossus, once a symbol of strength and stability, now groaned like a wounded beast. Through the haze of smoke and dust, she could make out figures stumbling through the wreckage, their faces etched with fear and confusion. The initial shock was giving way to panic. The Colossus, their home, their sanctuary, was being torn apart. Juliet pushed herself to her feet, her legs shaky, her head throbbing. She had to find Hansen, had to assess the damage, had to figure out a way to contain the fire before it spread to the rest of the rig. But as she stumbled towards the control room, a new horror unfolded before her eyes. The eastern horizon, once a clear expanse of gray dawn, now bristled with dark shapes. Not one, not two, but a fleet of ships, their silhouettes growing larger with each passing moment, were converging on the Colossus. Juliet's heart sank. This wasn't a rescue. This was an invasion. Elliot's escape, the explosion, the disabled safety systems. It had all been a meticulously planned diversion. A distraction. The fleet was closing in, a silent, menacing armada. They weren't flying any flags, no identifying markings, just dark, hulking shapes against the brightening sky. But Juliet knew with a chilling certainty who they were. Elliot's accomplices. The final piece of his elaborate scheme. The radio crackled to life, a harsh, unfamiliar voice cutting through the chaos. "Colossus, this is the Chimera. Stand down. We are taking control of this rig." Juliet grabbed the nearest working intercom, her voice hoarse. "Captain Hansen, do you hear me? This is Donovan. It's a trap. Elliot's accomplices, they're here. They're surrounding the rig." Static. Then Hansen's voice, strained and weary. "I hear you, Donovan. We're outnumbered, outgunned. They've disabled our communications. We're on our own." A wave of despair washed over Juliet. They were trapped, surrounded, with no way out. The first ship, a large, heavily armed vessel bearing the name Chimera emblazoned on its hull, pulled alongside the Colossus. Grappling hooks were fired, securing the two vessels together. Heavily armed figures, clad in black tactical gear, began rappelling down the sides of the Chimera, swarming onto the rig like ants. The other ships in the fleet followed suit, encircling the Colossus, a ring of steel around their crippled prey. The rig, once a symbol of human ingenuity and dominance over the unforgiving sea, was now a prize, a conquered territory. Juliet watched in grim silence as the boarding party secured the rig, subduing the remaining crew members, herding them towards the helipad. The faces of her colleagues, once filled with fear and confusion, now reflected a quiet resignation. They had fought bravely, but the fight was over. She found Hansen near the control room, his face bruised, his arm in a makeshift sling. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a weary sadness. "It's over, Donovan," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "We lost." Juliet shook her head, refusing to accept defeat. "Not yet," she said, her voice filled with a quiet determination. "There has to be a way," but even as she spoke the words, she knew they were hollow. They were surrounded, outnumbered, and outgunned. Elliot had won. He had played them all, using her own compassion, her own sense of duty against her. She thought of the flare, the burning ship, Elliot's desperate pleas for help. It had all been a lie, a carefully crafted illusion designed to lure them all into his trap. A group of armed figures approached, their leader, a tall, imposing man with cold, calculating eyes, stepping forward. "Juliet Donovan?" he asked, his voice sharp and commanding. Juliet nodded, her gaze unwavering. "Elliot Sullivan sends his regards," the man said, a cruel smile twisting his lips. "He said to tell you, you played your part perfectly." Then he gestured towards the helipad. "Come along, Ms. Donovan. We have a helicopter waiting to take you ashore." Juliet knew there was no point in resisting. She allowed herself to be led away, her gaze fixed on the horizon, where the fleet of ships, now bathed in the cold light of dawn, stood as a stark testament to Elliot's cunning and the devastating consequences of her misplaced trust. The young diver who had bravely answered a distress call had unwittingly become a pawn in a much larger, more sinister game. And the fleet that had arrived at dawn was not a rescue party, but the grim, inevitable consequence of her act of saving a man who was, in reality, her destroyer.